Hey guys, tonight we're walking the slippery cobblestones of 18th century Paris. No, seriously, walk carefully. The street under your feet is uneven, dimly lit by a flickering lantern nailed to someone's crooked doorway. And if you're unlucky, you're about to step in something that smells suspiciously fresh. You pause. You look down. You sniff. And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. This is Paris long before the Eiffel Tower, before those dainty cafes with sidewalk seating, and before the word hygiene had really caught on with the upper or lower classes. The city is booming with powdered wigs, perfume, and political intrigue, but also with rats, runoff, and dog poop. And not just a little bit. We're talking about an entire city fighting a secret, soft war against turds. You probably won't survive this version of Paris with clean shoes, or lungs, or dignity intact. It smells like cheese left in a sunlit carriage. And the worst part? Nobody seems to know whose job it is to fix the mess. Not yet, anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this sleepy history stroll travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, one cautious step at a time. Around you, Paris in the 1700s brims with contradictions. It's glorious. It's foul. You pass marble-fronted mansions with golden gates, then nearly gag as you catch a breeze drifting out of the open sewer running right alongside. That black ribbon of stink, politely called a rue takeout, cuts through neighborhoods like a lazy, malicious snake. Nobody knows what to do with it, really. And it is not empty. Above the sewers, the streets themselves are barely better. A layer of grime coats every surface. Boot mud, spilled wine, horse urine, fish guts, and, yes, canine offerings. Always fresh, always smelly, always dangerously camouflaged against the cobblestones. And for some inexplicable reason, dogs are everywhere. Paris has a dog problem, or maybe a dog personality. The French elite of the day, ever so fashionable, have developed a new obsession with lapdogs. They parade with poodles, cradle terriers, and feed tiny greyhounds roast quail from silver dishes. Little Marie Antoinette lookalikes, barely out of adolescence, stroll gardens with ribbons on their wrists and matching ones on their papillon's tail. It's all very charming until you realize these tiny, pampered beasts are relieving themselves with imperial impunity. There is no leash law, no bags, no shame. And then there are the working dogs, strays, mongrels, alley sentries, butchers' mutts, all forming a scruffy underclass of poop producers, constantly multiplying in the background. These aren't the brushed and powdered nobles' pets. These are rough, street-savvy creatures who scavenge by night and squat where they please by day. Their population? Untracked. Their impact? Let's just say you'll need to watch your step in any neighborhood, rich or poor. Historians still argue whether the explosion in dog population was due to rising urban food waste, a surge in pet culture, or simply poor enforcement of animal control. Whatever the cause, by mid-century, the problem isn't just visible, it's inescapable. You round a corner and spot something deeply Parisian, a noble woman stepping delicately from her carriage. Her dress spills out like a pastry, voluminous and pearled, and she's holding it up just inches from the ground as she tiptoes across the flagstones. But then, oh no, a slip, a yelp, a curse that probably involves the phrase "sacre chien." She's fallen victim to what every Parisian secretly dreads: the infamous Parisian sidewalk surprise. This happens daily, dozens of times, in silk shoes, in heeled boots, and wooden clogs. People fall. People curse. People pay cobblers to scrub out soles and tailors to replace ruined hems. The poop is becoming a social issue. But the real reason this brown tide becomes impossible to ignore? Smell. It's always the smell. See, Paris at this time is a perfume capital not by accident, but by necessity. Everybody stinks. The streets stink. And nothing stinks quite like fermented dog droppings basking under a summer sun. Carriages roll through it. People drag it into their homes. And the result is a kind of ambient funk, low, constant sour sweet like spoiled milk and rotting hay. One visitor from England famously wrote that Paris tastes of ammonia in the back of the throat. A charming review. One fringe theory, whispered by salon-goers and half-joking pamphlets, is that too much dog feces in the streets can confuse the senses and lead to irrational thought, what they call la fièvre d'urine. It's not medically accepted, of course, but then again, they're also using leeches to treat heartbreak. As you pass a bakery, you're hit with that contrast again. Fresh bread, then feces, then lilac powder, then vomit. It's an olfactory pinball machine, and nobody in authority seems to be offering a solution yet. Because here's the dirty secret. Cleaning the streets was never a priority. Not until someone important stepped in it. And someone did. There's a tale, part truth, part aristocratic urban legend, that one of Louis XV's mistresses once stepped in a steaming pile just outside Versailles. Her jeweled slipper was ruined. She screamed loud enough to alert the guards. And the king, tired of hearing about dog mess every time he tried to seduce someone, finally asked, "Why is this such a problem?" That question, reportedly muttered between bites of candied almonds, would kickstart a slow, awkward bureaucratic ballet that led to the most ridiculous and weirdly heroic job title in French history. But that comes later. Right now, you pass a group of children playing la crotte roulette, a game in which they hop around, trying not to step on any of the surprises scattered across the square. The stakes? A free tart if you make it clean to the bakery. A day of teasing if you don't. They shriek. They laugh. They dodge and leap like dancers. You wonder if any of this will ever be taken seriously. Spoiler, it will. Just not yet. For now, Paris remains a place of elegant banquets upstairs and ankle-deep hazards down below. A place where silk gloves and street sludge exist in the same breath. A place so beautiful, so cultured, so stomach-turningly stinky, it could only belong to this absurd and marvelous century. And as the sun sets over the Seine, the smell doesn't fade, it ripens, grows richer, thicker. Someone should really do something about it. Someone will, but not before the situation gets worse. Much worse. You wake up the next morning, still in 18th century Paris, and it hits you even before your eyes adjust, the smell. There's something about early sunlight hitting the cobblestones that reactivates every unpleasant molecule clinging to the ground. It's like the city is cooking something you never ordered, and every corner bakery is working overtime to distract your nose from the real breakfast menu. Stewed manure with a hint of dog. But today there's a new wrinkle, a gathering, a commotion. You shuffle closer to the edge of a public square where vendors are setting up for the day, shouting about eels, cheese, and firewood, when you overhear the words say intolerable. This is intolerable. It seems another high society shoe has met its unfortunate squishy fate. This time, the victim is a minor viscount with a very loud voice and a very clean white wig, now stained faintly at the tips from a misstep by the fountain. A small brown smear adorns the bottom of his cane. He's ranting to anyone who will listen. Merchants, flower girls, even a goat tied to a post. And he's not wrong. The dog poop situation has officially escalated from nuisance to crisis. In fact, it has a name now. People are calling it Loch Christ de Lombard Canine. You try to hold and chuckle. Historians still argue whether the poop crisis ever reached formal recognition in the city's records, or whether it simply lived on through complaints, cartoons, and biting satire in broadsheets. But the public reaction? That was real. It was loud. And it stank. Here's what changed everything. Dogs, which had once been regarded as symbols of loyalty and elegance, were suddenly everywhere. The fashionable elite bred them, flaunted them, even perfumed them. Meanwhile, middle-class households began acquiring larger breeds to guard homes and businesses. Working-class neighborhoods had mutts roaming freely. Dogs became, for better or worse, the unofficial citizens of Paris. And they were not shy about marking their territory. One quirky detail: many 18th century Parisians believed that a dog's droppings could predict the weather. A common superstition claimed that if your morning walk was interrupted by a steaming pile, it meant rain before noon. A dry, hardened one? Sunshine. Of course, this forecast system had its flaws. Still, the sheer number of dogs meant the streets became a minefield. Some public paths became effectively impassable without tiptoeing like a ballet dancer on stilts. Newspaper satire depicted nobles hiring poop scouts, servants who would run ahead, clearing a clean walking line with brooms and lavender oil. No one is entirely sure how common this practice really was, but it paints quite the picture. By mid-century, something else worsened the mess. The city's infrastructure was crumbling. Paris didn't have the kind of organized street cleaning you might associate with later 19th century cities. Rain would occasionally sweep waste down to lower levels, but in dry seasons, the excrement would simply accumulate layer by layer, like an unpleasant archaeological record. The Seine was already polluted with human waste and industrial runoff. Adding dog mess to the urban cocktail made it even more hazardous. And then came the tipping point: public health fears. Now, keep in mind, this is a century before germ theory, so nobody's talking about bacteria or viruses yet. But people did associate bad smells with disease in what was called the miasma theory. If it stank, it made you sick, which meant that in the public's nose, dog droppings weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. Pamphlets circulated. Local doctors warned that urban miasmas were contributing to cases of dizziness, fainting, and, one dramatic claim, infertility in unmarried women. Because of course it was their fault. Though these links are scientifically laughable today, the fears felt very real at the time. You stop to read one such pamphlet, nailed to a post beside the baker's door. It declares that Paris is a city decaying from below, and proposes a radical idea: fining dog owners for every offense. It even suggests that a citizens' army of dropping detectors be formed, equipped with chalk to mark each incident for inspection. It's anonymous, poorly printed, and honestly, not the worst idea. Still, the city leadership isn't quick to act. Most officials simply don't see poop as their jurisdiction. Sanitation belongs to one office, domestic animals to another, and the streets? That's a whole different budget. Everyone's responsibility means no one's job. Sound familiar? Until one day, a mysterious letter appears at the doorstep of the Hotel de Ville, the city hall. It's unsigned, but it's poetic. A full page of angry verse, lambasting the government for letting Paris drown in dung, while nobility strolls by with noses high and shoes sullied low. It refers to the sidewalks as mirrored mosaics and proposes that one day tourists will visit just to see the chaos. The letter includes a bold prediction. Within 10 years, Paris will be known not for its cathedrals or art, but for its monuments of manure. What's more surprising, the mayor reads it out loud at a meeting. This marks a slow cultural shift. Satirists are no longer mocking just the dogs. They're going after the officials who allow it all to pile up. Some of the more radical newspapers begin referring to the mayor as le maître du caca, or the master of the poop. No one wants that on their resume. And then, of course, the poets join in. Verses circulate mocking upper-class women for stepping in what their husbands produce in speech. One cafe famously creates a new dessert, tarte du chien, which is mercifully made of chocolate and shaped like a squatting dog. It sells out daily. The joke is tasteless. The crowd is delighted. Even philosophers weigh in. One fringe Enlightenment thinker suggests that how a civilization handles its animal waste is the true test of progress. That quote, ironically, would be rediscovered in a 1960s urban planning textbook. Back on the street, a boy scoots by pushing a wooden cart. It's full of wet straw and what looks like a shovel. He stops beside a pile and stares at it, calculating. Then he shakes his head and moves on. Not his job, apparently. That, right there, is the problem. By now, the aristocracy is threatening to build separate private walkways. The bourgeoisie wants fines and footmen with brooms. The poor just want boots that don't soak through. And still, no one is cleaning up the mess. Something has to give. The city can't keep pretending this is just an aesthetic issue. The dogs keep multiplying, the weather keeps warming, and the public keeps stepping in it. So someone, some brilliant, unfortunate someone, is about to stand up in a committee meeting and say the words that will echo through bureaucratic history. What if we hired someone? Someone to see the poop. Someone to record the poop. Someone to confront the poop. And just like that, the groundwork is laid. It won't be glamorous. It won't be simple. But it's coming. The poop inspectors are on their way. You find yourself at a long, wooden table inside a drafty stone hall, surrounded by powdered wigs and political exasperation. Parchment rustles. Someone sneezes dramatically. Welcome to a mid-century Parisian municipal committee meeting. What passes in this golden age of powdered nonsense for problem solving? On today's agenda, poop. Specifically, the ever-worsening crisis of canine street depositions and what on earth to do about them. The chair of the committee, a stout man with a monocle and permanent frown, sighs through his nose like he's already regretting his career choices. His job is to manage public order, not this. And yet, here they all are. You glance at the other officials in the room. Sanitation, public health, street maintenance, even an awkward representative from the clergy who insists on reminding everyone that dogs are unclean in soul as well as shoe. Nobody laughs. They're all too tired. The room smells faintly of wet parchment and old onions. Then it happens. A low-ranking bureaucrat, young, probably still optimistic, definitely underpaid, tentatively raises a hand and says, "What if we create a new post?" Silence. He fidgets. A kind of inspector, someone whose job is only to monitor street cleanliness, especially the canine kind. There's a long pause as everyone processes this. It's not a bad idea, really. But no one wants to be the one to officially write the job description. Still, things are moving. Slowly, messily, bureaucratically. Historians still argue whether this job was truly called Inspecteur de l'Emmerde, Inspector of the Poop, or whether that was a nickname gifted later by snickering pamphlet writers. Official documents refer to something far more delicate. Inspecteur de salubrite urbaine, urban sanitation inspector. But everyone in the streets knows exactly what that means. You don't get a fancy title and a stick unless you're looking for doo-doo. And so, the strangest hiring process in Paris begins. Applications flood in. Not many, but enough. Some come from retired soldiers used to long patrols. Others are desperate clerks hoping for a salary. One man boasts of an exceptional nose and provides a handwritten essay titled The Philosophy of Excrement. He does not get the job. Eventually, the city selects a group of test inspectors. They're to begin in select arrondissements, wearing long brown coats, unfortunate color choice, and armed with notebooks, whistles, and long walking sticks. Not to poke the droppings, though some do, but to point at them like tragic little museum exhibits. Their mission? Observe the streets daily. Log all incidents of uncleanliness. Record especially egregious piles and note repeat offenders. Mostly dogs, sometimes humans, occasionally drunken actors after bad premieres. They are also tasked, unofficially, with public shaming. If an inspector catches a noble woman's prize spaniel mid-squat, he is to approach gently and inquire whether the lady might provide for removal. This phrase becomes infamous, and newspapers have a field day with it. There's even a fringe pamphlet titled Provide for Removal, a Modern Romance, in which a poop inspector falls in love with a duchess while pointing at her dog's indecency. Spoiler, they elope. With a mop. You might think these inspectors are ridiculed from day one. And sure, there's snickering. Children shout, "Here comes Monsieur Pooh," as they pass. But within a few weeks, something odd happens. People start respecting the badge, or at least avoiding it. The presence of these quiet, observant men in long coats and buckled shoes actually works. Dog owners begin pulling their pets to the side streets. Servants carry extra cloths. Even some shopkeepers sweep their doorsteps out of sheer guilt. That's not to say it's easy work. You trail one inspector on his route. He's middle-aged, with knees that pop when he squats and a nose that's permanently wrinkled. He mutters as he walks. Occasionally, he jots a note, usually something like, Rue de Grandestines, 3 piles. 1 fresh. Suspect, bulldog. Possibly cursed. His tone is dead serious. Lunch breaks are taken standing up. Sitting on Parisian benches is a known risk. Back at headquarters, a small, underfunded office near the meat market, the inspectors gather each week to report findings. They sketch maps, argue over patterns. One man insists that a certain poodle is targeting him specifically. Another believes the dogs are organizing. He's only half joking. Then there's the paperwork. Endless scrolls of it. Every offense must be recorded. Street name, time of day, consistency, color. Yes, that level of detail. The more poetic inspectors start giving piles nicknames. The Royal Deposit, the Midnight Visitor, La Bombe Grice. Over time, a crude but effective tracking system develops. They begin pinning little red dots on a giant map of Paris to indicate hotspots. One neighborhood, near the opera, is nearly engulfed in dots. The inspector responsible simply writes, "May God have mercy on us." And then, slowly, patterns emerge. Certain breeds appear more frequently in reports. Pugs, spaniels, and a terrifying breed called the chien de boucher, butcher's dog, whose waist is described as biblical in volume. Of course, they're outliers. One nobleman swears his dog has never defecated once in its life. He believes the creature is too refined. The inspector assigned to his block files a separate, anonymous report that reads simply, "Delusion is dangerous." Not all the inspectors take their job seriously. One is fired after several reports turn out to be fabricated. He apparently never left his favorite cafe and drew his data from gut feeling. Another is dismissed after using his badge to flirt with maids. But for the most part, the position attracts an odd, meticulous breed of civil servant. Part investigator, part janitor, part philosopher. Quirky fact. One inspector, Jean-Luc Mounier, later writes a book titled Streets of Shame, which becomes a minor hit in literary circles. He compares droppings to the ink with which the city writes its sorrows. People call him pretentious. He gets invited to salons anyway. And through it all, the city begins to change very, very slightly. Sidewalks become a little safer. Slipper mishaps decrease. One particularly muddy street earns a small plaque for Most Improved Hygiene, 1768. The mayor even visits it, steps confidently onto the cobblestones, and immediately slips on a horse apple. Not a dog pile. Progress, technically. Still, the inspectors remain. Watching, logging, judging. They are anonymous, often ignored, sometimes mocked. But without them, the city might drown. And what? You already know. You're walking now behind one of the newly minted poop inspectors. Inspector Dupre, tall, gaunt, with a neck that creaks every time he turns his head. It's early morning in Paris, the sun barely filtering through the fog of coal smoke and the usual aroma cocktail of wet stone, old meat, and something sour you've stopped trying to identify. Dupre walks with purpose. You notice he taps the cobblestones ahead with his cane, not for support but to test squish. He knows the city too well to trust his eyes alone. His uniform, a long coat dyed a dubious shade of walnut brown, is both a badge of office and camouflage for any unfortunate encounters. The lapel bears a small silver medallion, a shovel crossed with a quill. It's official now. The role exists. The Inspecteur de Salubrité Urbaine is a real position, complete with city budget, weekly logs, and a very uncomfortable hat. Their task? Roam the city's arrondissements and catalog unsanitary street hazards, especially of the canine kind. They are not cleaners. They are observers, eyewitnesses to Paris's brown underbelly. Their appointment stirs both laughter and admiration. Poets call them scribes of the sidewalk. Children call them les piseurs d'encre, ink pierres. Dogs just bark at them. But Dupre doesn't flinch. He's one of the most diligent. Carries a leather-bound notebook labeled Observations, Le Quotidien de Gout, and the Daily Disgusting. He records with obsessive detail. Location, freshness, proximity to businesses, even slope of terrain. His notes read like battlefield reconnaissance. Rue Saint-Honoré, southeast incline. Specimen partially stepped upon. Trailing smear approximately 1 meter. Witness, shop girl. Emotional state, amused. You can't help but be both impressed and deeply disturbed. Historians still argue whether these inspectors actually had any meaningful effect on sanitation policy, or if their real legacy was psychological, simply making citizens aware of what they were stepping in. One thing's certain, people noticed when they were being watched. Now here's the funny part. Initially, these inspectors weren't welcomed. Some shopkeepers accused them of spying. Others thought they were secret tax agents. A particularly cranky barber once chased one off with a broom, yelling, "My customers expect hair, not horror." But slowly, as Dupree and his colleagues showed up day after day, rain or shine, something shifted. Residents began treating them like weather vanes for urban decay. Seeing an inspector on your street meant someone, somewhere, might care, might report it, might even fix it. One woman, a baker's wife, left a small tart on her doorstep every Friday for the inspector who patrolled her block. "To thank you," she said, "for saving my marriage." Apparently, her husband had slipped in something unspeakable one evening and swore never to walk her home from the shop again. Thanks to Dupree's vigilance, the romance and the tartlets returned. But make no mistake, this was no cushy government sinecure. The inspectors patrolled long routes, often covering miles each day, often on foot. Their feet blistered, their shoulders ached from lugging ledgers, and their nostrils endured a constant assault. There were no hazard bonuses, no medals, just ink and patience and shoes that could never quite be cleaned. The tools of the trade were few, but oddly precise. Each inspector carried a lead point stylus for marking curbs and lampposts near frequent deposit zones, a copper whistle for alerting nearby watchmen in case of sanitation disputes. Yes, they happened. A pair of thick leather gloves, just in case, and a rolled-up placard reading attention. Zone Sue inspection, to discourage fresh offenses during surveys. There's even a whispered rumor that a few inspectors developed their own rating system. 3 flies equals mild hazard. 5 flies equals catastrophic offense. 7 flies equals do not describe. The city never confirmed this, but a well-worn page from one inspector's diary reads, 7F today. Cannot unsee. Every few weeks, inspectors filed formal reports to the magistrates. These reports included maps, detailed logs, and recommendations for targeted interventions. More sweepers here, fines there, maybe a public poster campaign. Most of these suggestions were ignored, but one set of reports caused a stir. Dupree and a colleague had tracked a troubling trend, a rise in incidents near theaters and opera houses. The theory? Wealthy patrons were bringing lapdogs to performances, sneaking them under seats, and allowing them to relieve themselves outside en masse after curtain calls. One log entry reads, Place du Theatre Francais. 11 piles for breeds confirmed. Suspect, Pomeranian. Recidivist. The magistrates scoffed. The press, however, loved it. Cartoons flooded the streets. Caricatures of powdered aristocrats tripping over their own perfumed poodles, while an inspector in the background solemnly took notes like a war correspondent. One poster read, "The real tragedy is on the sidewalk." Still, enforcement was spotty. No one wanted to arrest a Duke's valet over a dog. But the pressure worked. Theater staff began posting signs. Some even hired their own sweepers. The inspector's presence, once laughable, now had teeth. And the job evolved. Soon inspectors were attending public festivals, political gatherings, even parades, not to keep the peace, but to keep the peace clean. At the coronation of a minor prince, 3 inspectors were stationed along the royal procession route, discreetly circling problem areas on a giant parchment map with tiny ink paw prints. One observer noted, they moved with grim efficiency. Like monks but disgusted. One fringe tidbit that survives. Supposedly, an inspector once tried to resign by submitting a sample of his ruined boots along with his written complaint. The boots were delivered to the mayor's office wrapped in silk and labeled Exhibit A. The letter read, My soul remains firm, but my soul's cannot. He was granted retirement. So who were these men? Most came from modest backgrounds, ex-soldiers, former clerks, even a few cobblers. They shared a peculiar blend of endurance, fastidiousness, and something like fatalism. They didn't expect glory, just less mess. A handful kept diaries. In them, you read not only about waste, but about beauty, how the sunrise looked when reflected off a puddle, hopefully just water, or how Parisians, for all their nonsense, still smiled when the streets smelled faintly of soap instead of stink. And the truth is, these men became part of the city's rhythm. Like chimney sweeps or fishmongers, they were part of the ecosystem. You didn't thank them, but you noticed when they were gone. Dupré himself became something of a legend. Never missed a day. Once confronted a duchess about her whippet's transgression and walked away with both dignity and a fruit basket. He was later honored with a toast at the inspector's annual gathering, a quiet dinner where they all wore clean shoes, as tradition demanded. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Even in a city of perfume and powder, someone had to look down and deal with what everyone else pretended wasn't there. And now, people were watching their step. You're out on the street again, Rue Malfatard this time, following a different inspector, Inspector Tasso, who's shorter, rounder, and far more cheerful than Dupré. He hums to himself as he makes his rounds, cane clicking rhythmically on the cobbles. Today he's demonstrating the ever-evolving tools of the trade, which he refers to proudly as the instruments of urban honor. You pass a particularly odorous corner, and Tasso pauses with the solemnity of a general surveying a battlefield. Well, he mutters, that one's a veteran. He leans down, pulls a small brass compass from his coat pocket, and begins measuring the spread like a geographer charting a small, unfortunate island. He then uses a stub of chalk to draw a neat circle around it. You ask why. To warn the others, he says without looking up. This is the golden age of poop detecting tech, if you can call it that. Inspectors have developed a whole toolkit. Not standardized, not officially approved, but passed down like sacred relics among their dusty brotherhood. There's the classic cane, of course. It's not for walking. It's a pointing device, a subtle warning, and in some rare cases, a probe. The city briefly flirted with issuing them official depth gauges to measure the severity of sidewalk contamination. That proposal was shelved after someone measured too enthusiastically and flung the evidence onto a wine vendor's cart. Then there's the notebook, or, as Tasso calls his, Le Livre de la Rue, the book of the street. He's personalized his with illustrations, including tiny sketches of offending dogs and side-by-side comparisons of the impact radius of various breeds. His rendering of a Newfoundland's misdeeds resembles a meteor crater. He flips to a page marked with a red ribbon and shows you his newest innovation, a poop classification chart. It's stunning in its detail. There are 7 categories, each with Latinesque names, ranging from Caninus minores, dime-sized, low threat, to Maximus eruption, sidewalk dominator, cause for immediate city alert. Some inspectors scoff at this level of scientific zeal. Others, they want in. Before long, the inspectors have started informal weekly roundtable meetings held in the back of bakeries or taverns, where they exchange findings, critique drawing techniques, and compare what they call splash factor. One particularly nerdy inspector begins using strings to calculate trajectory, prompting one of his colleagues to murmur, "We have gone too far." But everyone still listens. Historians still argue whether these inspector innovations had any meaningful bureaucratic impact, or if they were just the world's weirdest hobby club. But some of their ideas, particularly street, zone mapping, and pile density ratings, did influence later sanitation policies. Back on the street, Tasso is preparing to perform a demonstration. He unfurls a small flag, white with a brown circle, and sticks it delicately into the ground beside a large, fresh deposit near a school entrance. A few children peer out the window and cheer. One yells, "You missed one, monsieur." Tasso grins. "I'm not a magician." Flagging incidents became common for a time. It wasn't just for visibility, it was for data collection. Inspectors returned at different times of day to monitor which piles were cleaned, trampled, or miraculously vanished. They started timing decomposition, creating what became known as loose cycle naturel, an unofficial study of sidewalk decay. Some even created small wax models for training new recruits. One fringe tidbit from these efforts: an inspector once attempted to use a pet ferret to sniff out droppings. He claimed it was more precise than the human nose and immune to revulsion. The ferret promptly ran away. It was never seen again. Meanwhile, the city began experimenting with actual enforcement. Fines were proposed. Signs were installed. The first wave of public notices read, "Citizens, protect thy shoes. Offending animals will be noted." Of course, noted wasn't a real punishment, but it scared a few owners into caution. Eventually, real laws followed. Weak at first, barely enforced, but they were something. The inspectors weren't given arrest powers, thankfully, but they were allowed to issue formal warnings, a sort of gentle bureaucratic slap on the wrist. These notices had titles like Avis d'incivilite canine, notice of canine incivility. They came with no fee, but with the subtle threat of public embarrassment. You spot one posted on a doorway, handwritten in floored script, signed by an inspector, and gently passive-aggressive. To the owner of the brown spaniel who frequents Rue Cloche-Perce at 6 a.m., your noble companion has contributed, once again, to the city's decline. We beseech thee, carry cloth or abstain entirely. Enforcement may have been toothless, but the shame worked wonders. No one wants to be the talk of the bakery for all the wrong reasons. This was the real genius of the inspectors. Not brute force, but social pressure. The tools weren't just chalk and canes. They were visibility, presence, authority, however ridiculous it looked in a tricorn hat. And occasionally, they had to get creative. Tasso tells you about the time he partnered with a local painter to stencil small warning symbols near problem zones. Just a little dog-shaped icon, nothing threatening. Within a week, residents assumed a poop ghost was haunting the block. Superstitions flared. Offerings of bread and garlic were left near the worst alleys. Whether it worked because of fear or respect is still unclear, but the street cleaned up fast. Then there's the story of the inspector who bribed a street performer to pretend to slip in a particularly dramatic pile every morning at 9 a.m., right as the wealthy families walked their dogs to market. The daily accident became so notorious that the dogs were rerouted through the next arrondissement. As absurd as these tactics sound, they worked. Not everywhere, not always, but bit by bit, the inspectors turned passive filth into active policy. They weaponized embarrassment, artistry, and charm. Their real tool was consistency. Every day, rain or shine, in boots crusted with yesterday's regrets, they showed up, and the city noticed. Newspapers shifted from mockery to mild praise. One headline read, "Guardians of the Gutter, Why We Owe Our Shoes to These Men." A dramatist even wrote a one-act comedy about an inspector who dreams of being a pastry chef but can't stop categorizing eclairs by dropping shape. It flopped, but the inspectors loved it. Still, not everyone appreciated them. There were protests. One group of dog lovers, les amisticiens, claimed the inspectors were infringing on animal freedoms. A dog must poop freely, as God intended, they wrote in their manifesto. The inspectors responded with silence, and a map showing where those members lived. It was compelling. By now, the toolkit had expanded to include small brushes, signal lanterns for nighttime patrols, and, most controversially, a scoop. Not for cleaning, but for sampling. A few inspectors had partnered with early chemists, hoping to prove that certain dog diets correlated with smell severity. The studies were inconclusive. The embarrassment? Off the charts. Passo shrugs. We all do what we can. He logs one last offense for the morning, then carefully ties his notebook shut with twine. He looks out over the street, cleaner than it was, but not perfect. Some days, he says, it feels endless. But that's the point, isn't it? You show up anyway. And you realize, for all their eccentricity, these inspectors weren't just combating waste. They were fighting for dignity, one flag turd at a time. You're now underground. Not metaphorically either. You followed Inspector Fournier, a grizzled veteran of the Parisian streets, down a narrow stairwell behind an iron gate near Pont-Neuf. It's dim, damp, and you swear something just skittered past your foot, but Fournier keeps moving with the determination of a man on a mission. Because while the poop may be produced above ground, much of Paris's sanitation drama plays out below, down here in the sewers, tunnels, and dark arteries of the city. Fournier lights a small lantern and gestures ahead. This, he grunts, is where the reports go to die. You soon understand what he means. Above ground, the poop inspectors have created a quiet revolution, flagging hazards, compiling logs, issuing warnings, and gently shaming the rich into scooping their poodle's sins. But beneath their boots, a deeper, darker mess festers, both literal and bureaucratic. The city's sewer system is a disaster. Outdated, overloaded, and improperly mapped. It's less a network and more a labyrinth. Waste from homes, businesses, butchers, and yes, dogs, all ends up trickling or sloshing its way through these forgotten chambers. There's no organized filtration. It's like someone dumped the contents of a dozen chamber pots into a wine cellar and called infrastructure. And here's the kicker. Nobody knows exactly who is supposed to manage it. Fournier points to a mossy, broken pipe. That's from Rue Saint-Antoine. Been cracked for 5 years. I filed a report. Nothing. He's one of several inspectors who began noticing patterns. Certain streets were waste collected despite best efforts above ground. He started investigating, which led him down here. And now, he's basically an unofficial inspector of the underworld. Back at street level, Fournier maintains 2 ledgers, one for surface offenses and one for deep hazards. He's begun tracking how dog waste accumulates in gutters, slides downhill during rains, and eventually clogs drainage paths. His reports grow more alarming with every entry. But here's where it gets complicated. Fournier's findings begin conflicting with official records. For instance, one sewer junction is supposedly inspected monthly, but Fournier documents a thick, immovable wall of something. His sketch resembles a melting lasagna. He tries to escalate the issue, brings it to the Public Works office. They nod. They thank him. Then nothing happens. So he sends a second report, then a third. Eventually, he receives a polite but stern letter instructing him to limit observations to above-ground occurrences and to refrain from independent explorations. He frames it right above a map of sewer blockages labeled places Paris won't talk about. Historians still argue whether this friction between surface inspectors and city engineers represented a true administrative power struggle or just a classic case of paper pushing. What is clear? The poop inspectors had uncovered something far stinkier than sidewalk surprises: political negligence. And as the public pressure on street cleanliness grows, that negligence becomes harder to ignore. One day, a pipe collapses near Place Vendôme, releasing a bubbling torrent of sludge into an upscale boutique. A journalist writes, "The dogs did not do this, but their legacy flowed freely." It's the headline of the month. City Council is forced to hold a sanitation hearing. Inspectors are not invited, but someone leaks their reports, especially Fournier's, and the findings hit the press like a cow in a teacup shop. Maps, diagrams, testimonies. One drawing shows a network of poop hotspots overlaid on Paris's sewer map, shaped suspiciously like the face of a weeping woman. A pamphlet calls it La Déesse de Dung, the goddess of dung. Artists begin reprinting it for fun. The satire becomes inescapable. For the first time, the poop inspector's work is front-page material. They're no longer just footnotes in public hygiene, they're evidence. You now follow Fournier to an upstairs room above a wine shop. It's dim, smells faintly of vinegar and old ambition, and houses what can only be described as a poop inspector conspiracy board. Twine, maps, reports, grainy sketches of wealthy dog owners. There's even a chalkboard labeled "Who benefits from filth?" Is it a bit much? Absolutely. But also, he's not wrong. A particularly fringe tidbit emerges here. A theory, half serious, half paranoid, that certain nobles were intentionally allowing their dogs to foul working-class streets. To remind them of their place, Fournier says, he's never proven it, but he swears the worst piles always appear outside tax offices and bakeries before protests. Coincidence? Maybe, but the inspectors begin documenting it anyway. Then come the secret memos. One day, Inspector Tasso receives an anonymous note folded into his report journal. It reads, "Your work is noticed, but not all wish it so." Another inspector finds a false report inserted into his records, an incident he never observed, signed in someone else's hand. It appears the inspectors are being sabotaged, and yet the effort only sharpens them. The next quarterly report is their most polished yet, bound in leather, full of diagrams, pressed wax seals, even scented pages, lemon balm, mercifully. They distribute copies not just to officials, but to newspapers, salons, and, deliberately, to the palace. The result? Another scandal. This time, the stink hits royalty. A high-profile duchess's carriage is delayed because a flagged inspection zone blocks her route. She demands answers. Instead, she receives a full sanitation map of her neighborhood, color-coded and annotated with notes like frequent urination area and mild sludge drift. She faints, or pretends to. Either way, it's in Le Moniteur the next morning. The poop inspectors are suddenly celebrities, reluctant ones. They're interviewed, sketched in papers, even featured in a stage comedy called Les Nez de la Ville, The Noses of the City. Fournier is portrayed by a 12-year-old boy in a fake beard. He hates it, but for all the attention, their requests remain the same. Clean up the sewers, address runoff, enforce animal control, and, perhaps their most controversial demand, acknowledge them as part of official urban planning. The city stalls. Another committee is formed. Another investigation launched. But you sense it. The tide is turning. For the first time, the public sees these strange men in brown coats, not as eccentrics, but as witnesses. Chroniclers of a truth nobody wanted to look at directly. The inspectors had lifted the city's hem and shown everyone what lay beneath. And beneath is not just droppings. It's dysfunction. It's denial. It's decay. But now it's written down, mapped, flagged. And when Paris finally modernizes its sanitation systems in the coming decades, many of the earliest reforms will trace back, quietly, sheepishly, to the notes, diagrams, and filthy, tireless footsteps of the city's oddest civil servants. As you climb back up into the sunlight with Fournier, you squint against the brightness. The street looks cleaner today. Not perfect, never perfect, but cleaner. And somewhere, in an office above a butcher's shop, a new inspector sharpens his chalk. Because someone has to keep watching. Someone always does. You're back on the surface again, watching the streets of Paris shift with the slow, almost imperceptible rhythm of change. And somewhere in this bustle, Inspector Moreau strides along Rue de Petit Champs with a new kind of swagger. Because now, believe it or not, the inspectors are respected. Not universally, of course. There are still jeers from bored aristocrats and eye rolls from merchants whose stalls smell more like stable than store. But something has shifted in the public mood. Paris has grown tired of slipping, dodging, and scrubbing. The poop inspectors aren't just tolerated, they're useful. And in 18th century Paris, that's a rare form of immortality. Moreau wears a freshly brushed brown coat, his badge polished. His notebook has gold trim on the corners, likely a gift from a grateful landlady whose alleyway once resembled a battlefield. He tips his tricorn hat as he passes an apothecary, who nods solemnly and lifts a small jar labeled unguent for stepping trauma. You can sense it everywhere, the cultural tipping point. Schools are teaching children how to avoid pathways of risk. Shopkeepers post friendly signs reading, "No dog left behind. Please clean after your pup." One enterprising street musician even writes a ballad titled "The Canine Code of Honor," which becomes an improbable hit in wine taverns. And as the inspectors gain traction, so too does their voice. Not all of them are content to simply observe anymore. Enter Inspector Brune. She's the first woman to take on the role, unofficially at first. Brune was originally a laundress with an uncanny sense of smell and no patience for nonsense. She began accompanying her cousin, an inspector too blind to spot a pile unless it was on his shoe, and eventually started filing reports herself. When her accuracy and insight outpaced half the force, the city reluctantly hired her. Officially, she's called a temporary sanitation correspondent. Unofficially, everyone calls her La Patron of Piles. She's efficient, unflinching, and, unlike her male colleagues, bold enough to confront repeat offenders directly. One memorable scene involves Brune catching a Viscount's dachshund mid-deposit. She calmly hands the nobleman a folded cloth, smiles, and says, "I believe this belongs to you." The nobleman blushes. A nearby crowd applauds. The incident becomes an etching. Brune's presence inspires more women to join the ranks, some formally, some in the gray spaces between enforcement and stubborn civic pride. A baker's wife in Montmartre starts keeping a poop journal outside her shop, where neighbors tally offenses like a public scoreboard. Children start volunteering to spot and shout during market days. One little boy becomes famous for his battle cry, *crotte reparee, *poop spotted. Historians still argue whether this grassroots engagement with sanitation was a true proto-feminist moment or just an inevitable evolution of civic fatigue. Either way, it spreads. And so does the lore. By now, the inspectors have become part of the city's folklore. They appear in puppet shows, in prayer candles, mostly sarcastic, and even in love songs. One particularly odd opera features an inspector who falls for a revolutionary while chasing a poodle through the sewers. It banned after 3 performances. Audiences found it too relatable. But perhaps the clearest sign of progress? Legislation. After decades of shuffling, the Paris magistrates finally pass a formal ordinance. Dog owners are now responsible for their animals' visible leavings. Fines can be issued. Repeat offenders can be summoned to sanitation hearings. The inspectors are granted official enforcement documentation, small wax-stamped scrolls carried in leather tubes, known affectionately as les rouleaux de honte, the rolls of shame. There are still loopholes. Wealthy owners send servants to claim ignorance. Some offenders bribe inspectors with pastries. One family trains their poodle to relieve itself inside a hollowed-out carriage step. But still, compliance improves. The inspectors, for their part, continue to innovate. One designs a poop bell, a small hand chime rung discreetly whenever a deposit is spotted, prompting nearby owners to take action. It works about half the time. Another begins experimenting with lime powder to mark areas of concern. His boots become radioactive looking. Children call him Le Fantôme Blanc, and the public starts to notice something truly novel: clean sidewalks. Not all the time, and not everywhere. But certain neighborhoods begin to shine. The old minefields of the Marais now host strolling families instead of tiptoeing messengers. Opera-goers report fewer pre-show mishaps. Cobbled lanes once marked hazardous by inspector maps are downgraded to navigable. Quirky fringe tidbit. A group of amateur cartographers begins collecting inspector maps as art. Some versions even appear in galleries, displayed like war plans. One particularly dramatic piece, The Great Cleanup of Ruda Archives, is reprinted in silver ink on black parchment and sold to tourists for years. Of course, not everyone's thrilled. A small band of radical Parisians forms a short-lived movement. Les Défenseurs de Chiens Libres, defenders of free dogs. They stage protests where they encourage pets to defecate outside government buildings. It doesn't catch on. Too messy. Too literal. Still, their leaflets contain one half-decent quote: "A city without poop is a city without freedom." The inspectors respond with a modest chuckle and a chalk outline of a dachshund. By now, the poop inspectors have become iconic. You see it in the way children salute them, in the way butchers slide them the occasional sausage link, in the way even cynical city officials now refer to them in meetings with something like respect. One official even says, half-jokingly, that Paris owes more to brown coats than to blue blood. And there's even talk, yes, talk, of expanding the program to other cities. Lyon, Bordeaux, even Marseille. Paris may have been the first, but it's no longer the only city struggling with its canine conundrums. Delegations from other municipalities begin arriving to observe the poop patrol. They interview inspectors, review logs, and even join patrols, though they rarely make it through the full shift without retching. An inspector's annual assembly is organized, complete with badges, awards, and a satirical golden pile trophy. The first recipient? Brune, for bravery in the face of high society and high stench. And just like that, what began as a half-joke, half-horror civic experiment has become a model, a system, a symbol of what happens when a city stops ignoring the mess beneath its feet. You walk alongside Moreau as he logs one final offense for the day. A tidy one, recent, probably a papillon. He makes a quick note, circles it lightly in pencil, and then snaps the book closed. Not bad today, he says, with the weariness of someone who's seen worse. Not great, but better. You ask him if he thinks the job will ever go away, if one day the streets will stay clean on their own. He shakes his head. People forget. Dogs don't. Then he smiles. And besides, someone's got to keep the maps interesting. You're walking slowly now as dusk settles over the rooftops of Paris. The sky is lavender. The gas lamps flicker to life one by one, and the cobblestones, still warm from the afternoon sun, begin to cool beneath your feet. It's in this fading light that the inspectors do their quietest work. The end-of-day checks, the closing patrols, the final ledger entries made under flickering lamplight. Inspector Delaunay passes you by without a word, his coat buttoned high, his hat low. He nods once, then vanishes into the shadows near Rue de la Ferronnerie. No fanfare, no thanks, just duty. It's been nearly 50 years since the first dog poop inspectors were appointed. And now, their presence feels not only normal, but oddly comforting. Like knowing someone's watching the kettle so it won't boil over, or like seeing a lighthouse far off when the fog begins to roll in. The city has changed around them. What started as a laughable job born from public desperation has turned into a quiet institution. Though rarely praised and almost never rewarded, these men and women in their worn brown coats and ink-stained gloves have left their mark on the city, not with statues or parades, but with cleaner soles and safer strolls. And now, their methods are being studied. University students include inspector logs and sanitation case studies. Architects consider waste pathways when designing courtyards. One young civil engineer refers to the inspector's old ledgers as the humble blueprint of modern hygiene. Historians still argue whether this movement, if it can be called that, should be celebrated as part of Enlightenment-era progress or dismissed as a footnote in the long, messy history of urban waste. But every time someone walks the streets of Paris without having to scrape their shoe against a curb, they benefit from the slow, steady work of those who stare directly at what everyone else tried to ignore. There are, of course, stories of retirement. Inspector Dupré, the meticulous cartographer of canine offenses, eventually hung up his cane and moved to the countryside, where he reportedly kept a notebook of his chickens' missteps out of sheer habit. Inspector Tasso became a humorist, writing a well-loved memoir titled The Parisian Pile, in which he insisted the worst days always followed Tuesdays for reasons he could never explain. And Brune? She became a trainer of new recruits, most of whom were baffled by her toughness and moved to tears by her field sketches. She always told them the same thing: we don't stop the stink. We just make sure no one walks through it blind. Quirky fringe detail. Upon retirement, each inspector receives a commemorative walking stick engraved with their badge number, and a silver brooch shaped like a curled dog tail. Some wear them proudly. Some hide them in drawers. But none forget. You pause now beside a small plaque near Place de Vosges. It's unassuming, nestled between two street lamps, and reads, "To those who walked behind, so that others might walk ahead, eyes open, shoes dry." The Sanitary Watchers of Paris, 1757 to 1803. A woman walks by with her terrier. She has a cloth tucked under her arm and a tiny shovel hanging from her belt. When the dog pauses, intensely focused, she glances at you with a weary smile, then bends to clean up the mess. No one applauds. No one shouts. But in this quiet, shared gesture, you see the legacy. It's not in laws or uniforms or even maps. It's in habit. It's in the idea that someone must look down, take notice, and do the unpleasant work. Not for glory, but because society functions better when we all stop pretending the mess isn't there. You start walking again. The streets are quieter now. Paris hums with the gentle sigh of lamps, of clinking wine glasses, of distant violins. But beneath it all, someone will walk these stones tomorrow, notebook in hand, cane tapping thoughtfully, ready to point, to log, to quietly say here, this matters, because it always will. And now, as the streets dim further and Paris settles into sleep, you can exhale. The world of the poop inspectors may sound silly at first, absurd even, but beneath the surface lies something enduring. A story of quiet duty, of finding dignity in the undignified, of choosing to care even when no one else does. You picture them now. Inspector Dupre with his careful maps, Brune standing firm in silk-draped salons, Tasso whistling while circling another offending pile. They didn't fight wars. They didn't write manifestos. They simply kept the streets a little safer, a little less disgusting, one tiny notebook entry at a time. Maybe that's what makes their story perfect for bedtime. Not grand, but steady. Not flashy, but kind of comforting. Because in the end, progress is rarely glamorous. It's made of little choices, awkward jobs, and people who show up, even when the task stinks. Literally. So as you rest your head and let sleep take over, remember, someone, somewhere, is still keeping watch over sidewalks, alleyways, and all the strange in-between spaces we forget to care about. And maybe tomorrow, when you step outside and notice a clean corner where there could have been chaos, you'll think, just for a second, about the browncoats. And you'll smile. Now drift off gently, knowing the streets are safe, the lamps are low, and the world, though messy, is tended to by the quietest heroes. Good night.